I would love to ask each. So let me show you where we're at. We're doing a couple of things today. We'll see how far, we'll do our best. I'll do my best. Share screen. Let me go to intro. So if you're at the Intro to Judaism and Conversion and you go down to the syllabus for us, we're down at anti-Semitism, Holocaust in Israel. And I said orally, but it was not on this page until just now, that those requirements are down below. So if you go down to the books and materials, it says required videos to stream: the 50 Years War on YouTube, Israel and the Arabs, Elusive Peace on YouTube, the Oslo Diaries, if you can find it, and then any Holocaust movies of your choice. I gave some examples: Nazis and the Final Solution, Schindler's List. You could just click on the Yad Vashem homepage or video or YouTube channels, and I gave other options. And so I won't ask you if you've looked at them, but let me tell you this, which is, let me stop the share, that, sorry, I'm just trying to get back to where I was. Go up there. Thanks. Okay. Just needed something. Okay. So I'm just saying, do it for yourselves. Like, if you haven't done it yet, do it before conversion. Like, make it personal. It's between you and God. But those documentaries will give you enough knowledge to not only have your own moral positions on the Israel-Palestine issue and what I call the Arab-Israeli conflict, because it's not just a conflict between Israel and Arabs or Palestinian Arabs. It is a conflict. It's a regional conflict, and it's a long-standing conflict, and it should be. And it's not fair to either group not to understand it regionally. And in fact, honestly, I'm someone who likes to understand systems. It's even more than a regional conflict. It's really an international conflict. And what I mean by that, let me, it actually is, but the context is very international. If you start to understand the history, which most people are not interested in because they think it's just a moral issue. It's like if I said to you, I don't know, they think it's like, people treat the Arab-Israeli conflict to me like it's some kind of moral hypothetical you have to pass a test about. Like, let me ask you a question. If there were a group of 5 people and a bad person said, I'll kill all 5 of you unless you pick which one for me to kill. Do you pick which one to kill? Or do you say, we won't, that's called a classic, dilemma, ethical. People treat the Arab-Palestinian conflict like, I want to know what you really think. Like, do you think it should be Palestine or do you think it should be Israel? Like, it's some kind of moral hypothetical test. It's actually, a lot of it has moral dimensions, but it's very, very historical. So, for example, you realize that the Palestinians and the Jews, the Israeli Jews, have been manipulated by colonial powers, imperial powers, European powers, Arab powers. People do not know how much Israel and the Arab nations were proxies in the Cold War, how the former Soviet Union manipulated both countries. It's fascinating. It's just about the most fascinating thing in the world to study if it wasn't so damn tragic, like, because it's like, I mean, you would not believe the stories of what has gone on. So in that way, it is actually international because there's a lot of manipulation of both peoples, and now there's manipulation of the history. It used to be manipulation of actual actors. So I'm going to tell you what I think, something of a story. So if you watch the videos, you'll know the documentaries, you'll see perspectives from both sides. But the bottom line is the videos don't tell you what to think in terms of policy, what to think about Zionism. They'll just tell you the history, and then you can make your own decisions about what your own perspective is on the Israel-Palestine issue. I am going to, though, tell you a little bit of a summary of what I get out of the documentaries, and that'll happen right now. And let me see if I did it right. I'm giving you a link in the chat area, but I also already added it to the website. So if you go to the Intro to Judaism and you go to today's date, there's a link to a document I wrote out summarizing some of the things. So I'm going to do a little lecture right now, and I apologize. I know you're used to me lecturing, but I don't know any way of, unless we're going to just pretend we all watch the video and we can talk about it. I want to at least summarize some points that we can therefore discuss. Point number one. Let's go all the way back to the time of the Bible. So in the time of the Bible, the area of Canaan, the area that's now roughly Israel, Palestine, uh, it wasn't a country. It had Canaanites in it, it had Jebusites and Perizzites, and had Moabites floating through, and Midianites flowing through. It had Amorites, uh, and it certainly had Hebrews, our ancestors. What I mean by this is we're very much influenced today by a kind of European political model of nation states. Everything's always been nation states. They have borders, they have armies, they have governments. And when one infringes on, if one takes over another one, then it's colonialism. The biblical period doesn't have, it has a concept of empire, but this concept of nation state, I don't think it has. I think that's, I don't know where it started, whether it started with the Greeks and the polis or not, but I'm not a classicist. So what does it have? Has a concept of the land of Canaan. Many different peoples live there and they move around and they skirmish. And sometimes some are pushed out and sometimes they have to move. Because people are not living in concrete skyscrapers, sometimes you are pushed and you move along. So it's much more fluid in terms of there's a fair amount of open space. Some land is much more arable than other, and the people who have more power take the spaces they want or turn into vassals, the tribes that live there. But there are many different peoples that live in the land. There is not one indigenous people to the land in the early biblical period. I'll say pre-1000 BCE. Actually, it's even post, but say around 1000 BCE and before. You have tribes is even really the wrong word. So you have different kinds of self-identified people. Again, usually the Jebusites, Amorites, Canaanites, Philistines. I didn't even mention the word Palestinian, and this is really just trivia. Um, the word Palestine comes from the word Philistine, and the Philistines actually weren't even Arabs. So the Philistines settled along the Mediterranean coast. They were Aegean. They came from the Greek islands, and they're a little bit like the Vikings coming to Great Britain, if that's the right word for that area. It's very, very similar. The Philistines were bigger, stronger, better militarily, and settled along the coast like the Vikings settled along the coast and worked their way inward. And they kicked everybody's ass, including the Israelites, by the way. So a lot of this has to do with, but the Palestinians are not descended by the Philistines. I don't think they claim to be. They claim to be Arab, not Aegean. So getting back, I shouldn't have stopped with trivia. I'm sorry. It's just these interesting things. So the land has multiple peoples moving through it. Even scholars today are struggling with the idea that, if you see a map and you're like, Moab was there and Midian was there, but then you see these people like the Midianites and other, like, is Midian Yemen and is Moab Jordan? They're general areas where people were, but like I said, they could be pushed, they can be mushed. There was room. You could sometimes settle right near one, and if they didn't like it, they tried to chase you away, and sometimes they succeeded, and sometimes they didn't. So, and sometimes they had strongholds, and you would attack their stronghold or not attack their stronghold, and so it was power games. But so one way is to say they didn't have the concept of indigenous that we have today, which I think is largely derived from, at least in America, a kind of understanding that the land of North America was not European. And so there's a sense there were people here first. That paradigm doesn't move very easily onto the Mideast, particularly in the land of Canaan, because of the fluid motions of people and the coexistence of multiple peoples sharing the land. Another way to put this that is an easy way for me to think about it when I'm having these high level, most of the discussions these days take place in 20 characters or less. So you're really talking about low level discussions. I would simply say multiple peoples were indigenous to the land. So a lot of discussions today are the Jews were not indigenous to the land of Canaan and it was Arab. It really wasn't. They were different ethnicities, some from what today we call the continent of Africa. There were peoples that came from what today we call Yemen. There were people of different skin tones, different skin colors, different languages. There were people who came from north. It was a real crisscross area, but Canaan housed different kinds of peoples. And what I'm perfectly happy personally to say they were all indigenous to the land. But Nadav, how can you say that? The Jews were not indigenous to the land. The Torah says that they were in Egypt and then went to the land and conquered it in the book of Joshua. The answer to that is that most scholars would say that the Jews who were in Egypt were only one branch of the family tree of what we call the Hebrews. You can see in the book of Genesis, we're not called Israelites, we're called Hebrews. And we talked a little bit at the beginning, we talked more than a little bit at the beginning of the course about the Hebrews being a nomadic shepherd tribe who mostly lived in Canaan. So the ones who ended up in Egypt at the end of Genesis and then have to be freed and are enslaved and have to be freed in the beginning of Exodus would have been part of the family tree of Hebrews, not all of them. Even if it were all of them, they were already one of the indigenous tribes along with other indigenous tribes. I mean, even if you say the Philistines were indigenous, although they clearly weren't because they just got there on boats. But let's just, I'm willing to say the Philistines are indigenous too. Whatever. But the Hebrews were already indigenous to the land of Israel and probably a little farther north because the country lines weren't as drawn into Lebanon and north from there into Syria. So the area they went from basically from the Tigris and Euphrates, particularly through Syria into Israel today, there were Hebrews, there were multiple peoples. So conclusion from that is, I would say that the idea that the Jews are not indigenous to the land of Israel is itself wrong. But I wouldn't say we are the only people indigenous to the land of Israel. So then the country forms at approximately 1000 BCE under the first King Saul and then King David and then King Solomon. And they move the capital to Jerusalem to bridge the northern and southern kingdoms. And even under the period where basically Canaan was for 1,000 years was the Jewish state. I mean, it really was Israelite. I'm sure there were other indigenous peoples who lived there as well. So I don't want to say there were no other people there. I bet coexistence was a pretty normal fact of life back then. And so there were other people. It wasn't a country in exactly the way we think of countries today. So it certainly was the Jewish country. It had a king. It was conquered many times. But I bet there were other people of other ancestries who lived and other traditions who lived there as well. And so I'm just quickly covering 1,000 years that way. One of the things that happened is the destruction of Israel at the hand of the Babylonians and at the hands of the Assyrians. And there are some great YouTube videos I was watching. One of the great things I believe the Assyrians invented, they were the first big spreading empire. They came up with, they were partly responsible in that region for creating centralized bureaucracies rather than loose confederations. So we have a lot in common with them in the United States of America, very centralized bureaucracies. And one of their main tactics to enforce them was moving indigenous populations. So we can blame it on America, we should, but we can also blame it on the Assyrians 3,500 years ago, well, a little bit less, 3,000 years, 2,500 years ago, 2,700 years ago, and so when they conquered Israel in approximately 600 BCE, they also moved significant portions of our population out. And they did that to every population they conquered. It was a super brilliant tactical way to destroy, to subdue. And they basically invented it, and it's been used ever since. I know I bore you guys with these stories, but I loved my 2 years living in Indonesia after college. And the Indonesian government, which was it still is, but it was military dictatorship. One of the ways they dealt with indigenous, it's over 15,000 islands. The way they dealt with indigenous cultures that didn't want to be subdued by the military dictatorship is they stuck them in boats and they put them on another island. So it is, and I could see it happening. It's a great way to destroy a people and take them over. Bottom line is already Jews were pushed out, Israelites were pushed out of the land during the Assyrian conquest. Now I'll jump to the time of the Romans, approximately 100 BCE to 70 CE or AD. And in that time, um, the Roman occupation of Israel was especially horrendous. And toward the end of it, approximately the time of Jesus or just after Jesus's death, the the um, the Romans, and a lot of this kind of got hidden in history. It's been recovered more recently. They murdered a significant portion of the Israelite population. I mean, probably in the hundreds of thousands, which is probably like, I don't know what massive percentage. I mean, even if it was, so those are historically recorded massacres that were traumatic for the rabbis of the Talmud and had a lot to do with the creation of Judaism, as we've already discussed in the course, out of a national identity into a religious identity. And as I mentioned before, a lot of the success of Judaism, why we are a rabbinic religion rather than a biblical religion, is what the Pharisees did was they took all portable elements of the religion and and said that will now be what we call being an Israelite or being a Jew. And I suggested we could do the same thing with America. We could say if we had to prepare for our land to go away, what would every possible way of being American that could be portable and taken somewhere else? So that's why we're rabbinic Jews today, and that's where we survived. And that's one of the reasons that when Karaites tell me, why aren't you, who cares about the Talmud? We should just follow what's in the Bible. Well, they did a pretty awesome thing with the Pharisees by creating a portable nationality. And we've been a portable nationality ever since. And we lost some things along the way, and they just did, I think, a lovely job of it. So back to the Arab-Israeli conflict, now back at the time of the Romans. The Romans also did a mass expulsion of Jews, like the predecessors. So they slaughtered a significant portion of the population, and they sent many out. And so the idea that Jews did not exist in Palestine, I don't know, in the year 1880, 1850, is really an awful thing to say when we were indigenous to the land along with others, and that we've suffered unbelievable persecution in history. It is not to compare what other people suffered. In fact, it's great to study what all kinds of different peoples have suffered and been persecuted with, because it helps us understand ourselves and not have it happen again. It's not a competition, but the idea that Jews should be dropped from the notion of persecution as if, well, my doctor and my lawyer and my agent are Jews, so let's stop talking about Jewish persecution. It's racist, plain and simple. So I don't even like the word anti-Semitic sometimes. It's plain Jew hatred. So the Romans killed a significant portion of the population, exiled others, along with others who are already in exile, which is largely how we end up with, most Jews end up either in the northern African and Western European countries, or they've emigrated through Mesopotamia over past into the Eastern European countries. So it is during both pre-Roman and Roman that Jews end up with large populations, but even pre-Roman in Egypt, Cairo, Alexandria, Morocco, uh, all the way. I mean, there were communities in what today we call. I'm trying to. I don't. Anyway, I'll just keep going, all the way through Morocco, Spain, France, large population, all the way through Italy, and then all the way out. So Jews have been expelled, 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 and they made their lives as rootless, largely like the Roma, largely like gypsies. They were very similar in those countries where they were not, as we talked about anti-Semitism, but importantly, in most of the countries in which they lived, their rights were determined by whatever sovereign was there at the time or local official. They weren't entitled to the same rights that natives had. They often weren't allowed to serve in the army. They weren't allowed to often go to schools. They could be massacred, and whether they were entitled to any protection was determined by the local leaders or the king at the time. And so anti-Semitism, anyway, they were persecuted in those countries. Back to Israel. So nevertheless, there were still tens of thousands of Jews in the land that survived all those persecutions. And places you can go in Israel today, there are Jewish villages that have been around since Roman times and before. One of my favorite places is Tzfat. So Tzfat became the center of Jewish mysticism, and most Kabbalah came out of the town of Tzfat. It's been Jewish for over 2,000 years. It's been Jewish since the time of the temple. And no one disputes that, even Arabs. I mean, even Palestinians, even I think Hamas wouldn't dispute that. So that there were Jewish enclaves that stayed Jewish all the way through. Then you have two sets of crusades. You have the Muslim conquest and you have the Catholic conquests, which killed a lot of Jews. So Jews just haven't caught a break living in the Holy Land. And so what happens in the Arab-Israeli conflict is that typically, and I watch these videos on YouTube, I don't know why, they just raise my blood pressure. But they will often say, let me tell you how many, Jews going back to Palestine is a fiction. I mean, this idea of returning to a homeland is all a created fiction of Jews. Because the truth is, and then they'll give you a statistic of the number of Jews who were living there in the 1800s. So the 1800s is the lowest point of Jewish population basically in history in the land of Palestine or Israel Palestine. And so if you're going to start your history lesson in 1850, 1860, you're going to have something in the thousands of Jews. But they'd constantly been persecuted there, killed, slaughtered, and expelled. And they were all around there, like all around Morocco, Egypt, all the way down. Yemen had a big community. So Jordan. I mean, so they're like, they're circling it because they've been killed and pushed out. And then this idea is like, well, let me tell you how many were there. There was no country of Palestine. Of course, you guys know that. But I would deny that there was even really a consciousness of an area like Palestine. Most of Israel was really considered part of Jordan. It was in the Ottoman Empire, you know. So like it was part of the Ottoman Empire, and most Palestinian um, Arabs had connections to Jordanian families. So it was and later in the Arab-Israel conflict, it looked like a very logical solution, even by the Palestinians themselves, to really just set up a homeland in Jordan because of their very strong connections to Jordan. And in fact, the Arab community under British rule and under Ottoman rule was largely ruled from Jordan. So it was a little bit like the Jordan hinterland. That's my view. People can yell at me for having it, but that's my honest appraisal of the history without worrying about what people think. It was kind of like the hinterland of Jordan, and it was ruled from Jordan, and the sheiks of Jordan, and the families of Jordan, and every time, okay, so there's that. A lot of the Palestinians that lived in Israel, people say that this is sort of a racist thing to say. I'm going to say it anyway. It was not a large population in Israel itself. When Mark Twain made his trip to the Holy Land, he famously said, "I went to the Holy Land and no one was there." And I mean, and I'm not trying to say that there was not in it. So I want to be careful about this. Were there Arabs living in Israel and had for generations in Israel, Palestine? Absolutely yes. Were there more than Jews living there in the 1800s? Absolutely yes. But we also have to understand the context of how that came about. We also have to ask, did those Palestinians have a sense of having a separate identity apart from Jordan? Say no. And that's why eventually they considered making their homeland in the West Bank of Jordan, or in the West Bank of the Jordan River as part of Jordan. And that comes up later in the story. That's basically the 1970s. So was there room in what's Israel Palestine in the 1800s and 1900s for people to come by land and settle? Rather, yes. Now you can call that colonialist, but I'm telling you, there were room for Jewish villages and there was room for Arab villages. Was a lot of Israel arable? Yes and no. Some of Israel, Palestine was arable, but man, I mean, my first trip there was in the 80s. A lot of it was rocks and desert with no irrigation. And strangely, a lot of the north was malaria mosquito infested. It was swamplands. There was a reason it wasn't heavily populated. It was a tough area. So starting in the 1880s and 1890s, There was a movement, there were multiple extremely bad pogroms, just straight up Jewish massacres in Ukraine, in Russia, in Poland, where entire villages were massacred. And they, as I said before, they had no police protections. And a movement came to say we should go back to Israel. And small numbers of Jews went back to Israel in the 1880s and afterward and bought land from Arabs. The land was not that expensive. Now, one could say that's colonialist. That's up to others to label, but that's what happened. And they set up collective farms, particularly in areas that weren't worth much, like draining swamps, and many died in the north because a lot of that initial work was draining swamps and trying to create agriculture in places that didn't have it. And they really came out of socialist mentalities. Most of them were atheist socialists who believed that part of anti-Semitism was caused by the Jewish spirit being divorced from nature and getting too like orthodoxy, too intellectual, too out of touch, and still believing in the old ways of God, which is kind of silly. And they were motivated by returning to the land. They were very influenced by socialism. So Jews started moving there, and that's where the story of, by the way, if is anybody a George Eliot fan? I am. George Eliot's one of my favorite novelists. It was a woman, her name was Marianne Evans. She was certainly not Jewish, but her last novel, she's famous for Middlemarch and The Mill and the Floss, but I love her last, Middlemarch. Her last novel was Daniel Deronda, and I think it's like a masterpiece. And I'm going to totally spoil the end. It's about an English gentleman who finds out he's actually Jewish, and he doesn't want know what to do with his identity. It's about an issue of does he embrace an oppressed identity, or does he pass as a gentleman? And he's he's not sure what to do, and it's long. And now I'm totally going to spoil it. And this was published, I think, in 1882, Daniel Deronda. So at the end, he decides to get on a ship for Palestine. Like it, I mean, so that shows how far this goes back. I was like, what? When I first read it, I had no idea what the end was. No one, I just read it because I was after college and I was traveling in Indonesia and I wanted something to read on the boats and buses. Um, so so they went there. Looking back, Palestinian, I don't know what to call them, theorists, professors, thinkers say that that was colonialist. And and like I said, that's a word that's open to interpretation. My question is this: if colonialist is moving into an indigenous land, then I would say it is offensive to say that Jews returning to Israel, which is the entire story of the Bible, is and it's real. You know, Arafat and other Palestinian leaders simply said that part of the Bible is wrong, but the parts that Islam embraces is right. I mean, even Islamic thinkers don't understand how that can work. But yes, we were indigenous to the land. Other peoples are indigenous to the land. Now, let me go back to the Bible for 1 second, and this is kind of a radical idea. The end of the Torah, with us entering the land, basically assumes that the land will be shared. So it assumes another really, really, really big idea that I think is never introduced into the discussion. Deuteronomy at the end basically says, you guys have been nomadic your whole lives. You've been living on that land, but it wasn't a possession of yours. You didn't get to basically build farms on it. And you're going to go in. But this is the deal with land, capital L. All land is owned by God, and you are lucky to dwell upon it. And this is not just true for Hebrews or Israelites, it's true for every human being. So the Torah basically ends in Deuteronomy by saying, when you enter the land, remember that the land does not belong to you, and it will throw out anybody who is immoral. Now, what immoral means is open to interpretation. But I actually think that's really a helpful guideline today. I think the land can support multiple indigenous peoples like it did before. And I think sometimes one may lose their right, and that includes Jews, by the way, to be there when they act immorally, especially genocidally, nationalistically, racistly. And so I'm not picking sides on that one. It's not like, is he talking about the Palestinians don't deserve to be there? I'm really being honest. I'm not picking those. There's a way in which you need to share the land, and that when your behavior is not suitable, you don't deserve it anymore to be there. So it's just a principle. I don't have a clear application of it in today's language. So now let's go to the 1900s, okay? And now I'm going to throw up a graphic, and I'll share the screen. And thank you. I have it in two places. There we go. And how do I do this not talking too much or not reading too much? But I kind of told you that pre-1947, there was Jewish immigration to Palestine at the same time as Jewish immigration to the US, fleeing persecution. They bought land from Arabs. It was a relatively peaceful coexistence. There was a fair amount of land, most of it kind of yucky, to share, and they could stay away from one another. And sometimes they even were friends. As the land increased in value and fertility, Arabs from other countries immigrated too, which is a fact that's often forgotten. In 1947, hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors had no place to go. Arabs, fearful that they will come to Palestine so Arabs there will become the minority, put pressure on the British to end all immigration to Palestine. Now, I talked about the larger actors here. When the Holocaust ended, still on the books of the United States was the U.S. Immigration Act of 1924, which prevented Jews from immigrating, or it prevented Jewish refugees from coming to the United States of America, which affected those fleeing from Hitler both before the Holocaust, and it was still on the books after the Holocaust. So when you had people like Truman, as a soldier before he became president, and others liberating the concentration camps, those people had no place to go. They actually couldn't come to America. And if going back to their villages, their property had been taken, their relatives had all been murdered, seriously complicitly with their neighbors, who we know today often would actually have picnics to watch the mass shootings while they took place, because that's the way human beings work. And so they couldn't go home. There was nothing there. They couldn't go to the United States of America. They really wanted to go there. And as new revisionist history coming out in the past 10 to 15 years shows, many of them actually were sent to Palestine a little bit against their will. They were like, basically they had nowhere else to go. But the idea that they couldn't wait to go to Palestine, when they weighed 70 pounds, many died, of course, after they were liberated because they couldn't digest food and they were too sick to recover. But basically, the other European nations would not take them in either. So there was a conspiracy to not take in the refugees, and they had no place to go. So there was talk about a conspiracy of those who are the colonialist nations not to take in refugees. They liked the idea of sending them to Palestine. And I personally know very many, they're mostly now dead, Holocaust survivors who would tell me their story, who they were children at the time, and they had lost their mom and dad, everything, and then they would meet with a Zionist person from Palestine, a Jew from Palestine, who would come and say, how would you love to go to Palestine? And basically would, I don't want to use the word brainwash, would, basically indoctrinate them to be like, it's going to be great. You're going to be able to be a Jew. And it's going to be hard when you get there because we're going to scratch out an existence, but trust me. So there was a way in which this was fostered on all sides, except the Arabs were not consulted with that. Okay, so the Arabs were a victim, as well as the Jews being a victim, of what to do with Holocaust survivors, and it's a very, very awful part of history. So, and the Arabs had a point, which is if you send them here, they were okay with coexistence. They were not okay with being a minority in that area. And I can understand that. Okay. The United Nations barely endorses a partition plan of Palestine, which, while imperfect, made a lot of sense by trying to divide creating a new state of Palestine that would be Arab majority, and a new state of Israel that would be Jewish majority, and Arabs from the Jewish part could move freely to the Arab part, and Jews living in the Arab part could pick up and resettle in the Jewish part. And large, like the West Bank was certainly part, because it was right on the Jordanian border, it made perfect sense, was in the Arab part. So as you can see, the Arabs rejected it, and they saw that they had a refugee population who did not have an army, who were emaciated, and they intended to massacre and kill them. That's the truth of it. They usually just admit that. So fighting begins between Arabs and Jews in the villages along the road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem as Arabs block the road, and the Palmach, which is an assortment of Jewish, let's say, guerrilla fighters. It was those Jews who were like, we're going to get the guns and the rifles, we'll buy them on the black market, and we will get our trucks through to get the food to the people in Jerusalem. Sensing war, Arab villagers begin to flee Palestine. While the Jews kill the Arab commander Husseini in battle, who is part of the famous Jordanian Husseini leadership, then the Arabs retaliate with a major counteroffensive, taking many Jewish lives. In retaliation to this, a band of Irgun, meaning Jewish militia, attack the Arab village of Dar Yassin. They encounter an unexpectedly large military force. Out of 132 Irgun soldiers, 42 are wounded and 6 killed. So they're surprised. They think they're going into a soft target village. They find a Palestinian military force there. And in a panic, they start shooting at the houses and throwing hand grenades. And they massacre 14 Arabs who had surrendered, and they kill 110 Arabs. The Arab press, hoping the Arab nations will be spurred to attacking the Jews, highly exaggerate the story, including, for example, the Jews were raping pregnant Arab women. They put this on the wires, and it goes out to all the Arab countries and is still taken as fact today in the Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq. The plan backfires as Arab villagers who fear for their lives now flee Palestine. Half the Arab population, over 750,000 Arabs, flee Palestine in the months before and after Dar Yassin, and then the British pull out. They're like, we're just going to leave and take no responsibility for the situation that was created. Now, I'm going to just unshare for a second. This early time is really complex, and it plays a lot into the discussions that happen still today, which is that a lot of energy is put on by those who on the Jewish right argue that those 750,000 Arabs, at the time they didn't call themselves Palestinian, let's just say Arabs, that they fled voluntarily. There is a lot of energy on the left to say they were forcibly pushed out. The truth, historically, is it's in the middle, which is that it is clearly true that at that time, 5 Arab countries say they will invade Israel, invade Palestine, kill all the Jews and drive them to the sea, or make them surrender. And they tell the Palestinians to get out of the way as they roll tanks into Palestine. Well, that's true. So the 5 attacking Arab countries say, get out of the way because we're going to bomb the crap using tanks and bombs out of the cities. And then when we round up the Jews and subdue them, you can return. So many of those 750,000 did go voluntarily. It is also true that, like with Dar Yassin, Jews were going village to village, not everywhere, but in areas that were strategic, and did tell Palestinians at gunpoint, leave. In the strategic areas, particularly along the road between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, the lifeline of their army. So those on the right don't like to admit that, although now they're forced to, that tens of thousands, probably under 100,000 Palestinians were, it's definitely under 100,000. I think it's closer to 30,000, 20,000. Hezbollah, Hamas would say it's closer to 80,000, 90,000, I don't know. And Palestinians were forcibly removed. So there's the narrative of they voluntarily left because they wanted their Jewish neighbors killed. There's the narrative that they were forced out at gunpoint by evil Jews from their homes. And the truth is somewhat in between. But I think that if you're like me and you step out of the politics and you get to know people, most people are just people. And I feel like those people didn't have a lot of a choice. When everyone's leaving because there's fighting taking place, you grab your family and your stuff and you go. And the idea that later people are going to say you went because you wanted your Jewish neighbors killed, or someone else says you went because you didn't have a choice because of the Jews. You went because it wasn't safe, and you went because your neighbors were leaving. You're not a politician, so it's tragic. But about 750,000 Palestinians left their home and ended up in the West Bank, Gaza, and left the areas that were mixed together. So let me go back to the share screen and go back to the history, because that is a crucial part of the history in terms of talking about. Um, it's often referred back to it. In 1948, at that time, David Ben-Gurion declares a Jewish state, and in America, America was severely anti-Semitic even after the Holocaust. As you know, this is the country that produced the racial genetics that were equally evil against indigenous people, people of color, and Jews, that Hitler was influenced by the idea of getting rid of people of color, of eugenics, which basically was popular in this country in America and was actually in many ways imported by Hitler to Germany, which in many ways had a less racist culture until him. And in any case, the reason I mention that is um, it was expected that Truman would oppose recognizing the state of Israel because America relied on the Arabs for oil, and the Arab countries were a much greater power. And people say that Jews controlled Truman and the Jews control America. But if you watch the documentary, you see what Truman says for himself, which is he said, all of the polls and all of my advisors and the people in my own political party are telling me we absolutely have to stay out of this conflict because we just finished a war and we don't going to get drawn into another war. And he said, I don't care because I liberated the Holocaust, the concentration camps. And he says on national TV, he says, I have nightmares to this day. And the idea that I would look at those people and say, I'm not going to support a homeland for them, I refuse to do. I officially recognize the state of Israel. I'm ordering our ambassador to recognize the state of Israel. It's a very interesting turn of events. And to everyone's surprise, the Russians don't want to be left out of the conflict. And because they see if the Israel state works, it'll clearly be a socialist state. It's largely Jews who are influenced and who are basically practicing Russian socialist politics and ideology. Um, some of it in Russian. So they're like, oh, beginning of Cold War, they want to also be allied with that state so that it becomes a Soviet satellite. And so, and I know you're probably thinking I'm down in the weeds, but I'll try to pick up the pace. Um, the next day, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria invade Israel. 40 million Arabs oppose 500,000 Jews. A large part of the Arab population flees Palestine, expecting to return after the fighting ends. The U.S. will not help Israel. They won't get involved because they won't get drawn into another war. But the Soviet Union sees an opportunity, as I mentioned, and they send the Israelis arms. Fighting for their lives, Israel defeats the invasion, but Egypt keeps the Gaza Strip, and Jordan keeps the West Bank. So Jordan could have set up a Palestinian state in the West Bank where all of these Palestinian refugees are, who are part of Jordanian families, and they choose not to do so. On February 24th, 1949, the countries agreed to a ceasefire but not peace. Then, after a military coup in Egypt, Nasser takes power. He conducts, this is the history people don't know. He publicly is super anti-Israel, but secretly he conducts talks with Israel, exploring the possibility of peace. But he argues that the political reality is that if he does so, he will be killed in a coup because he will have no popular support. Meanwhile, the Holocaust refugees continue to arrive. And at that point, and this is a very important story, you've heard it from me before if you come to services, Remember how 750,000 Palestinian Arabs were displaced? Approximately 800, just call it the same number, right? Just round. The same number or more Jews living in Arab and Muslim countries are expelled in retaliation. So, in retaliation for the end of the war and the basically failure of the Arab countries to take over the area, that amount of Jews are expelled from Arab and Muslim countries, and they have no place to go but to go to Palestine and to settle in Israel. Of the 900,000 Jews who left between 1948 and today, approximately 600,000 settled in Israel and 300,000 in France and the US. In some cases, Jews were able to take money with them, but in most others, like Libya, Iraq, and especially Egypt, the most probably wealthy community, the government confiscated all property. WOJAC, which is the World Organization of Jewish Refugees or whatever, estimates that $1 to $300 billion worth of Jewish property was confiscated from Jews when they were killed out on pain of death, and the Jewish-owned real estate left behind exceeded 4 times the size of Israel. It's important because there are refugees on both sides. This is not a way for me to say Israel is right and the Palestinian anti whatever you call it. I mean, I'm not taking sides in the Israel-Palestinian conflict. What I'm trying to say is you got to know the facts, which is a lot of people were displaced from a lot of manipulation, and this is not a case of one aggressor and one victim. It's interesting how those things are much more fluid. By the way, the next things I'll skip over, but they're really, really, really important, which is that Egypt is manipulated by the Soviet Union, and Israel and Egypt are manipulated by America. They're basically, there's a lot going on with capitalism and the Cold War and in the intervening years, and they're very important to understand. The Israelis conquer Gaza and Sinai in 1956, and then 1967, they are attacked again. The Soviet Union decides it would be an excellent Cold War move to have Egypt defeat Israel, because they've now decided that Egypt is their ally, the Soviet Union, and Israel as allied with the United States. And so they decide to get rid of that. They want basically Soviet control of the entire Mideast. And the way to do that is to get rid of the one ally, which is Israel. And so they trick Nasser to enter Sinai and invade it. They kick out the UN. He kicks out the UN force there, close the Strait of Tiran, the waterway to Israel. Jordan then reluctantly allies with Nasser, and Israel panics, as in the 1948 war. The US refuses to help. Israel annihilates the Egyptian Air Force in a preemptive attack. Again, this becomes a very important talking point for Palestinians, which is Jews say they're just doing self-defense, but they killed a lot of Egyptians in 1967, and it's absolutely true that the Egyptian Air Force was destroyed on the airfields by the Israeli. I know people who participated in that attack, but basically Israel realized that we would be in danger of losing a war, and they destroyed the planes on the ground. This leaves the Egyptian army in Sinai without air cover. 338 Israelis die and 15,000 Egyptians die, because without air cover, the Israelis push back the Egyptian army, which was very poorly trained. Egypt dupes Jordan into attacking Israel, and because they're getting attacked, and so one Arab country tricks another Arab country into attacking the Jews, and the Israelis actually recapture the old city in the West Bank. Post 1967, the Palestinians attack Israel from Jordan. You have the 1970s, which were very much about maybe Palestine forming in the West Bank and in Jordan. And it's the period of hijackings, the rise of the PLO. But one of the things that happens is the PLO decides to assassinate King Hussein and just take over Jordan and make Jordan and the West Bank the new Palestine for the Palestinians people. So the long ethnic and other union between Jordan and the Palestinians comes to an end. It has never been reconciled. The issue, obviously, when you try to kill the royal family, there's going to be a problem. They get kicked out of Jordan, where they have been welcomed, sent to Lebanon, and that produces the period of the PLO flourishing in Lebanon, launching international terrorism for many years, including the 1972 massacre of Israeli athletes at the Olympics from there. There's a civil war in Lebanon between the Christians and the Muslims, and the PLO inserts themselves because they're basically moving all their militias and forces there with the Muslim side. The Christian side asks for Israeli help, namely arms shipments. 1973, Egypt and Syria attack Israel on Yom Kippur. 1976, there's the Yom Kippur War, which was touch and go whether Israel would win, and there's a lot more in the documentaries about it. In 1977, 1978, the leader of Egypt goes to Jerusalem and signs the Camp David Accords for an Egypt-Israel peace treaty, shows that peace in the Middle East is possible, and that peace treaty has held, even through the Sadat Mubarak government falling to the Islamic Brotherhood. We'll see where it goes, but people who say peace treaties can always be changed later don't study history. For the most part, treaties have a way of holding, and that is a good example. There is a mess that happens in 1982, which I will not cover here. It has to do with Lebanon, and it's an embarrassment to Israel and human rights because of one radical guy guilty of war crimes named Ariel Sharon. But moving along, and we're getting to the end. We're up to 2000. So a whole documentary is about this, and it's very important. This was a very important time, in my opinion. In July of 2000, the leader of Israel, Ehud Barak, and the leader of the PLO, Arafat, or Fatah, and Bill Clinton meet at Camp David to try to work on a final peace deal at the request of Barak, who asserts that Rabin taught him that it's more important to be a leader of destiny rather than successful in the short term. Because earlier, Barak had offered Syria the return of the Golan, but Assad had rejected the offer, and he just decided he doesn't care if people hate him, he wants to make peace. Barak and Clinton offer Arafat a Palestinian state consisting of all of Gaza, 92% of the West Bank, 8% of other useful territory, dismantling all of Jewish settlements outside of the 8% of the West Bank appended to Israel. The Palestinian capital would be in East Jerusalem, massive international aid, shared sovereignty of the Jerusalem holy sites though with full Palestinian custodianship. And in a private, so what happens is that they are ready to sign the treaty, and then Arafat privately tells Bill Clinton he's leaving because if he signs anything, he'll be assassinated. Bill Clinton tells him, Bill Clinton has written extensively about this, he tells Arafat, then you never should have been the leader of your people. He's like, that's what it means. It means that you change the entire destiny of your people and you put your life at risk. And Arafat says, yeah, that's not my view. And he abandons the deal that his own negotiators had negotiated. And some of those negotiators are today leaders of the Palestinian Fatah movement. And they have memories of those deals because they were in them. The next day, Arafat flies back to Jerusalem and announces that the Jewish temple is a myth with no historical basis. And the Bible is just wrong about that. And he will only sign the deal if it's written into the document that Jews are not indigenous to the land, along with full Palestinian sovereignty over the holy sites. Everyone, including his own negotiators, are stunned by the new idea, which negates any possibility of a treaty. The summit ends without any agreement. Arafat actually returns as a hero to his people for refusing to concede 1 inch. Clinton later wrote in the New York Review of Books in 2002, the true story of Camp David was that for the first time in history of the conflict, the American president put on the table a proposal based on UN security resolutions, very close to the Palestinian demands. And Arafat refused even to accept it as a basis for negotiations, walked out of the room, and deliberately turned to terrorism. That's the real story. All the rest is gossip. And that is also a story that is tested to by people like Hanan Ashrawi and those who are the leaders in the West Bank today of Fatah. Ehud Barak is politically devastated because Israelis are furious that he would have offered that deal. He tries to resurrect the peace process with Arafat, and it basically goes nowhere. And that is the beginning of the Jewish right taking over. Because since the Jewish left under Barak has failed, the Jewish right coalesces also under the idea of not giving up 1 inch in the conflict. So here we are at 5:06. You've been patient for an hour. That's the history of the conflict there. I didn't even go into the Oslo Accords and everything that's happened since, but basically, you've been very patient. I mean, there's so many details in there. Okay, so where do I want to go with this? We have different concepts of what it means. I'm trying to give you tools in your own thinking and your own arguments in the future. Tools that have been helpful for me is more than one people can be indigenous to a land, and getting ex, getting massacred, genocided, and expelled from your land doesn't mean you're no longer indigenous to it. And Jews have Jews have every right to feel connected to that land and want a piece of it. Another truth is that deals that 90% of the refugees on both sides, I mean, like normal, no, I don't mean the leaders at the table. I don't mean people posturing to be the appointed leaders of their people. I mean dentists, people who build roads, people who just want to go to college and have majors, Jews in Israel, Palestinian Arabs, 80-90% of them would be thrilled with that deal. You hear about the person that says, my grandmother can't go back to Haifa and get her house back. The truth is, a lot of that was incorporated. Right of return was in those deals. Like this idea, they don't talk about right. I actually heard this year. There's no right of return. Yes, there was rights of return in both deals for hundreds of thousands of people that could have returned to their homes. You know, you're returning to a state that's a Jewish state, right? But there was, I mean, you're talking about right now the Palestinian refugees. You're talking about the great grandkids of people who own property. The idea to say, well, that's still my house back in Haifa. There are things called reparations, and they could have been done. The idea that there's no possible solution is actually it's horrible, and it is manipulated by leaders on both sides. Leaders on both sides, nationalistic Jewish leaders and nationalistic Palestinian leaders, have not contributed to peace. And that's just a fact of the matter on both sides. The people who have tried to make peace failed, but I think and it's very, very sad. Let me give you one more thing before I open it up, and that is I'm going to put in the chat area. So here, there are three things in the chat area for those who are just streaming it later. A Jewish state, a democratic state. I should say all of these are in Israel. I mean, a Jewish state in New Jersey. If you're talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict, you have three things: a Jewish state, a democratic state, and the state includes the West Bank. If I'm a Jew and you're a Jew, you'll all be Jews if you're not already inside. You can have any two of those, but you can't have all three at the same time. I didn't invent this. Any negotiator, everyone who studied the Arab-Israeli conflict has known this for 50 years. And I was taught at Stanford, and it's still true today. You can't have all three. If you want to have a Jewish state that includes the West Bank, it ain't going to be democratic. If you want to have a Jewish state that's also a democratic state, you got to give the West Bank to someone else. You either should have given it back to Jordan before Jordan hated on the Palestinians, and then just said Jordan and Palestine, there'll be some kind of, like it was before, I was saying, like Palestine's the west part, whatever, that you figure it out because they're ethnically unified and genealogically unified. Or it's just Palestine. You just turn the West Bank into Palestine. So, and then what's left can be a democratic Jewish state. Or you can have one state. It can be democratic and include the West Bank. It just won't be a Jewish state because there are as many or more non-Jews living there. And so you're not going to have a Jewish star on your flag. And you know, I mean, and all of those are really kind of viable options. I just want to be honest. Like, but that those the options have been around forever. Like, and I will say that every now and then you'll see a editorial that says, I used to believe in a two-state solution, now I believe in a one-state solution. But I just want to make sure no one ever seems to know what they're talking about. What they're talking about is you give up on the word Jewish. In other words, it will be a state that includes the West Bank, and it will be democratic. And I'm talking about liberals who publish that. We're going to have one state solution that the Palestinians will be happy about. And then, it's kind of interesting. There are other states, there are other countries that do this. There's a parliament, and in the parliament, it's kind of like half Jewish and half Arab. I'm open to that. I just want to be like, personally, like, I want to hear more about that. Sure. That's not something I rule off the table. It's like, it would be interesting. What would it be like to have a country in which Arabic and Hebrew were the two official languages? I don't know. There's national vacation on Ramadan and national vacation on Passover. I mean, like, that really may be what has to happen. Or maybe that will eventually happen. So I just want to say, like, that's a real thing that no one seems people will mention, but they never actually follow through on. If it, you try to make democracy work, what's the army going to look like? What are the taxes going to look like? What do you do for religious people? Do you subsidize the mosques and the ultra orthodox fundamentalist breeding grounds of hate? Or do you say, you know what? We're all done with that. We're not subsidizing the radical mosques, and we're not subsidizing the radical yeshivas. Like, time to be a modern democracy. It could be fascinating. So I'm just saying, one idea is you give up on the idea of a Jewish state, and you let the people democratically figure out through a parliamentary structure how they're going to create coalitions and what rules the country should have. Another is, I already talked about, another is you create a state like the Barak did, which is that it's mostly the West Bank plus other territories that make sense, and you have to dismantle settlements to do it. Or you tell the people who live in these radical right-wing colonialist settlements, Jewish settlements in the West Bank, you tell them, listen, that's now Palestine. It's up to you if you want to live there. We don't know if they're going to massacre you. We don't know if they're, or not. Maybe they'll, I don't know. Like, I'm just saying that if you want to move, we won't dismantle you. You can stay if they'll let you stay, but that's between you and them. But it's not Israel anymore. We're not protecting you anymore. And if you want to, you can move to Israel, and we'll give every family $300,000 apiece to start over again. We can print money in this world. We've learned that, so you can do stuff like that. So that's really where you're at. It wouldn't be a Jewish state; it'd be democratic, be larger. It would be, or it's a state where you have Palestine over there. And then the final thing is what the coalition in Israel today basically officially wants. And no one except the radicals that I told you about, starting with Ariel Sharon, after Barak's peace deal fails with Arafat, which I blame on Arafat, but after that deal fails, and basically the democratic left-wing Israeli Jews are viewed as impotent, and it's the discrediting of the liberal. As soon as the peace treaty fails, then anyone who would negotiate with the enemy is a traitor. So today, that has led to the government today under Netanyahu, and their view is, oh no, we're fine with a Jewish state that includes the West Bank, and it's just not democratic. We're fine with an apartheid structure. We're fine with the Arabs who want to live here, they're welcome to live here. They can't vote, right? They can vote for dog catcher. They can vote for who's going to pick up the garbage. They can vote for municipal positions, right? They can have fake power, but they can't have real power. And that's why rabbis like me, this is a brand new territory, which is we've had those radicals in government before. We have had them say these things, but now they literally have so many nationalist Jewish settlements in the West Bank that it's hard to know how to come away from the national position. So that brings us up to the present moment, and I want to open it up, and I'll put some questions here, which is, What would you like to know from me that I didn't cover? Do you feel free to have your own views of the conflict and of Israel, or do you feel pressure from me or others to think a certain way? And the reason I'm saying that is I just want to get on the record, and then it's Tiana. In order to convert, you have to believe, in my opinion, that there deserves to be a Jewish homeland, or a homeland where Jews are absolutely guaranteed to be safe, somewhere in the area that is now Israel. But that doesn't mean you have to support the government of Israel. It doesn't mean you're not allowed to say there's settler colonialism I don't say there's settler colonialism going on, but you can. So in other words, you have to have some kind of Zionism, meaning Jews deserve a place of their own, that they're safe. What that looks like can be up to you, and you're free to have your own views. You're not controlled by me. Tiana, would you share where you're at, or anything you want to share?
Yeah. So I actually live with a very extreme history nerd, particularly obsessed with the era around World War II and really just all sorts of things in history that I've never been good at history, so I'm not going to pretend to like be able to describe that well. So I actually have watched at least the first three videos that were.
Wow, yay! You're the first one I've ever had, Tiana. Thank you.
Really?
I don't know. I don't ask anyone. Go ahead.
So I watched all three of them and we watched them together because I like debating like in a healthy way. So I'm like, I want you to watch these with me because I want to know like what your point of view is from what you know about history, and I'll tell you like what my point of view is. So not gonna say how many times we had to pause those videos and carried out long arguments or ended up pulling up a map on like my living room TV and like going like this area is this and this area is that, like all of that stuff. It was a lot of that. But I find that we disagree mostly because of Zionism. Now, for me, even before I considered myself religiously Jewish, I had always believed that Israel was for the Jews. Like that was always, I don't know why, I don't know where that belief came from, but that's just always what I had believed. And now being religiously Jewish, I look at it even more so, you know, understanding the history and understanding what our ancestors had been through and understanding also like the history of religion and things of that nature. But his point of view, which he's more of like a like very progressive, like democratic sorts of views on things, which I am too. Um, he's like, well, the history really doesn't matter. The way that he sees it, he's like, well, Israel has been propped up by, in a lot of cases, the United States with their weaponry. And right now they're just more advanced. And right now they're just like being bullies. However, from my perspective, I feel like it's way more complex than that. And you can't exclude the history. And I think that's where a lot of people around my age are going to um, start having some splits. Actually, I was looking up some history or some statistics, I should say, and I was finding out that most of the people who strongly support Israel are like conservative Republicans who I believe are like the boomer generation. And my generation is leaning more towards favoring Palestine. And I was like looking up all these charts with like the demographics of different age groups, different like whatever other statistic groups of people, and how they look at the conflict. And I think that a lot of people that are around my age, they really want to ignore the history and they really also want to ignore the religious significance behind it. Because, well, I should also mention that this history nerd that lives with me is an atheist and is also not my husband, different person. But yes, that is really interesting to me. I think that the history makes everything so much more important. The way that I see it fundamentally is that we were passed around and kicked out of everywhere. We were like murdered all the time. We were essentially treated like rag dolls. And now that we have a piece of what we see is the final pie, we have to do whatever needs to be done to protect that and make sure that no one can take it away from us again. And I also see it as like, just because like there may be, and I want to do more research on this, a split at some point. There has to be a split at some point, just like there is pretty much everywhere, where religion and government separate. And so, the acts that are done by like the military and stuff, they're not necessarily religiously backed, but I understand why they happen, and I understand the bigger picture, I think, in a deeper way. And I, which I'm not saying anyone else has to be, or like I'll judge anyone for not being, but I am like pretty much fully on the side of Israel. Like, I wish there was a better way to handle things, but especially after watching those videos and looking at all of the attempts to make peace and how all of those failed, it is very convoluted. Uh, I will say that the videos kind of make it seem like Israel is not good at holding up their end of deals, or they're really good at taking something that seems like they'd be giving some kind of compromise, but using it to their own advantage to actually get more of what they want. However, from an intellectual side, I'm like, that's actually really smart though. So I find this like, I'm in this place where like I support Israel, but obviously some of the things that they are doing, conflicts with religious beliefs, the way that they're treating other people. And it's very heavy. It's a very heavy subject. It's no longer just like this thing that I once saw in the news and was like, oh, that's happening. That's awful. It's way more than that. So I just wanted to share that feeling of like loathing, like of true conflict where it's like, I can see this, I understand this. It may not be right, but I understand why it has to be done. So I just wanted to share that.
Before you go, I just want to say thank you for sharing that. And Tiana, not only was that really articulate, but um, you are so ready to go to mikvah.
Oh,
Like in so many, and not just because of the end part, like you know what I mean, because of all of it, all of it from the beginning to the end. You're really, if only other Jews would be like you know, really.
thank you. That
No, I
means
mean
so much to
everything from
me.
the discussion, the sharing, the seriousness, the heart and the head, and all of it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Before Abby goes, I just want to add one thing, and I don't mean to be simplistic, but I think that part of the hatred of part of the hatred of Israel as colonialist settlers today is that I've never I see such. It just happened this morning to an event I went to on ecology. That the young people there, and for me, I'll just say young is, let's say, under 35 or 35 and under, is they're they're so pained by the moral issues of America, as they should be. I mean, one of the things I thought when you were talking, Tiana, is that I love the 1619 project, but one of the reasons I loved it is it was historical. And then it kind of devolved into these like little talking points that were not historical. And I get so sad because you know what I mean? Like the power of it was like telling histories that we didn't know and sharing those. And then when it became just like, oh, I don't need to read any of them because all I know is blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? And you're like, no, like, so I felt that way, Deanna, when you were talking about like, I think the history is important because it's like, no, it's almost like I don't need to hear the stories anymore because I know people of color always get the shaft. And I'm like, no, it's exactly why we have to read the histories, and not just to know that, but because it's part of engaging with our own humanity collectively. But anyway, the thing is, I've noticed that sort of young people, they are so pained by the fact, and I don't blame them, that we live on Native American soil, indigenous soil here. They're so pained by the racism in our country that they benefit from. And mostly, I mean people who are, let's say, white, but there are also others in this country who benefit from privilege. Let's just say even with money. You know what I mean? Generational wealth is kind of a big generator of privilege, so it's not just skin color. And as I've said before, really, really, really expensive private schools whose price tags are like above $50,000 a year, they love teaching anti-racism because they love not talking about issues around generational wealth. They want to talk about skin color, right? Because it has nothing to do with my money. It's just all us white people have to have issues. So young people feel so pained that this land has been stolen and that they participate in colonialism, they participate in exploitation, and they kind of have this hatred of the American government that I think they can't deal with it. They can't deal with the fact that, well, then how do I go to U of M? I mean, how do I go to a house that is clearly here in Michigan on someone else's soil? And it all gets put on Israel. It all becomes, it's those white Jews who took over those people of color's homes and killed all the indigenous people and now have them rounded up on reservations. Oh, I mean, whatever they call them, refugee camps, and don't let them back to their homes. And it becomes like, it's like they can't deal with their own pain about America and they project it onto there. And it's really sad because I know it's coming from a holy and pure place, but it's also kind of like, hey, please don't take your issues and like, why can't we let the issues there, let their issues be their issues. Let their issues be our issues, but don't make their issues our issues. Okay, anyway, I'm talking too much. Abby.
So I have to just say what Tiana said was incredibly, like, very moving and really hits a lot of the points I was thinking, because I spent many, many, many years studying political science and history. That's what I studied in college. That was basically when I decided to teach. That's what I figured I would be teaching all the time. And I thought I would be teaching it on a high school level, not on a middle school level. And I was prepared to actually be teaching a lot of those topics. And I spent a lot of time actually focusing in on like Cold War era issues. And I formed very distinct opinions on these sort of things. And even as a younger person being an undergrad, 20 years ago, I remember having the very simplistic view at the time of always believing in a two-state solution because I felt everyone deserved their share. Going back, generations to looking at, the biblical era, I understood both sides of the argument. We could bring it up thousands of years, and I still understood both set people deserve their share. And now looking at through a religious lens and still looking at through a political lens and looking at through a common sense lens, you have to view it in so many different ways. And I think when we try to view it from looking at from Camp David forward in the past 20, 25 years, this is where everything changes. And if we want to be able to move forward in any way, we have to be realistic and understand that nothing is going to happen until we understand all relevant players. And we've known for a long time that there's multiple voices in the conversation. We've known that for years now. But we actually have to acknowledge that the voices of Palestine are just as important as the voices of Israel. And whoever's going to be moderating the conversation, whether it's America, whether it's Egypt, whether it's the UN, or whether it's some entirely different third party, they actually can't be sitting back. They actually have to be actively working with this and helping to make things happen. And we have to understand that there is going to be a lot of give and take on both sides. It's not going to be something that's perfect to both sides. No one is going to come out of the situation happy. And that in the end is what politics is, though. There is no one is going to come out perfectly happy. But if we want to have any sort of semblance of peace in the end, you can't have it be a one-state solution. Like you said, for the 4 reasons you listed, you're not going to get all 4. you're going to get 3 with one big part, and it's going to end up with people very unhappy. But you can't have the concept in my mind of a modern day Israel without having a permanent homeland. We aren't a portable people anymore. We are a people who have faced all these challenges, and we have gone through these struggles that we have also, I don't want to say earned, but we've gone through the time to fought for having a homeland. We've struggled, and we've earned it in the same way. If we can say Palestine has earned it, we've earned it too. If it goes back to the idea that there is more than one indigenous group of people, we earned it. We've developed that right just as much. The struggle I find now is something that Tiana brought up, is that being that I am typically an incredibly progressive, democratically supporting, left-wing person, is that I am like shamed hardcore for being an Israel supporter, that I am not like a supporter of like the Free Palestine movement, and that even being a middle ground, like let's think of two-state solution, that I get a lot of flack from people about it, and I have for quite some time. And it was very different because I went to do my undergrad on the west part of the state, where everyone was hardcore, Israel, but then coming back and doing grad school on this part of the state where everyone was like Palestine, it's been a very interesting experience because there is no middle ground, and it feels like anymore. You're one side or the other. There is not. It feels very like there's very little ground for the middle anymore. You're one side or the other. And that's where I feel so much of the conflict of supporters develops of both sides, is that there isn't a middle anymore. You can't really, the middle doesn't exist anymore. We have to reform the middle. The middle, if there's going to be a middle anymore, of people who support the idea of the two-state solution as outsiders, that voice doesn't really exist anymore.
I feel the same way too, and I think it's really just well articulated. I feel terrible that I feel the same way, by the way. Even in some of my rabbinic circles, I feel like I'm not, progressive enough. And it, some of it, I'm just going to be blunt. Some of it is I feel like everyone's competing to be the worst victim. So it's like, well, Jews are victims, but maybe a little bit, but that was old, and now and it's like there's a lot of victimhood and there's a lot of power that goes around here, and I just don't think anything fruitful really comes out of trying to figure out, like, I win the worst victim contest or something. Um, the power is much more complex than that. One thing I did want to say is that one of the really sad things about what you're saying is that the leadership on both sides, even in America, but has evolved into the extreme views.
Yes.
And it really makes me wonder. I got really scared in San Diego when I was renting my U-Hauls to move out here and stuff. And, I realized, it was before even then, but the U-Haul guy ran a convenience store and he was a Palestinian immigrant. And I was like, well, you see my kippah, and I said, I'm really sorry for what's going on in Israel. And if you'd rather, I just said, listen, just, you don't have to serve me. I can go somewhere else. You're entitled to whatever view of me because I'm wearing kippah you have, and he just said, and he was saying, who I hate, I'd throw out of my place? The leaderships. He was like, you think Hamas represents me? You think Hezbollah represents me? He was like, you think Fatah represents me? He was like, it's a little bit of what's sometimes the Thomas Friedman argument in the New York Times. I want a better life for me and my family. Yes, I want a Palestine. You know what I mean? Yes, I want a homeland. Yeah, but like, BDS doesn't represent him either. But I want to throw things over to Axiomara because she's got a hand up.
So I'm looking for a quick answer. I don't mean this is a question I have about the meaning of the West Bank and Gaza. Um, I've been sorting through I've been sorting through maps, and the different changes in the territories. And your synopsis makes it clear that this is like incredibly, incredibly complicated. I lived in England when the IRA was throwing bombs in restaurants, and I never thought that the IRA and the British government would ever come to any kind of agreement. I mean, Northern Ireland just seemed like it was going to be condemned to chaos for the rest of the world, for the rest of time. So, and I don't know what happened such that there was an agreement reached, but, I lived in a place where that sense of it's just never going to happen existed, and it was a very strong feeling. So I guess I make that point to say we should always have some optimism, even if there's this sense of there's no common ground because everything is so polarized. And polarization is like now a worldwide, kind of characteristic. But how is it that the West Bank ended up being the West Bank? And then Gaza was, I guess the question is, how did this, I mean, I know Jerusalem is in there, but how did these lands become the source of conflict? Is it because in the partitioning, they weren't partitioned? I mean, if you look at a map of Africa, and you look at it post-colonially, all those state boundaries were produced by the colonial powers, right? I mean, some of them actually make sense, but the lines and the ethnic groups don't really correspond. And it was really a question of colonial bureaucracy that created these borders. So I'm just wondering about the significance of these pieces of land to the general discussion. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean,
Okay.
I probably can't answer. I would want to. I don't know if I'm an expert on the geography, and I mean the questions are really important. So I wouldn't say that I am the last word on this matter. I'm more a temporary word, but I think that part of what's going on is that the West Bank has always. You're talking about the West Bank in Israel. I wish I could make this like bigger in a way that works. There we go. The West Bank and its context in Israel is that this southern area where Beersheba is largely is very desert, and then the northern area up that's kind of greenish is where the swamps were. And I knew I was going to click on something by accident. Okay, I'll try not to click on anything. You see the Gaza Strip over on the left, but I think what we're basically talking about is in the early 20th century, during this period of of Jews trying to return to the land, buying some land, is that they largely they founded Tel Aviv outside. They founded Tel Aviv, which was like the first straight up Jewish village. They had some Jews up here, like in Sfat, in the northern areas, and they settled along places like Netanya, and they settled. There were already Jews in Jerusalem. There have been all the way since the time of the Romans, and Jerusalem basically existed. You can see where Jerusalem is there. Jerusalem existed in multiple quadrants. It existed in an Armenian and Christian sort of Greek Orthodox quadrant. It had a Muslim quarter and it had a Jewish quarter. And there was what I'm saying is there was kind of a pre-existing dividing land between areas where Jews had lived, were starting to live, and where Jews didn't live. So Bethlehem has been an Arab town for, I think, thousands of years, certainly many centuries, but probably all the way back. Hebron occurs in the Bible, right? Abraham goes to Hebron. At that point, it's Hittite, and so the Hittites are around there, and then he buys a burial plot for his family and Hebron has been Arab for however far back. But I hope you don't mind me interrupting, but it's relevant to your question. One quick tangent is only this. historians for a while had the hypothesis that places like Hebron were not the biblical Hebron because there's no possible way that a town would have the same name. And it was probably everything got renamed by during the period of the Crusades so that the Catholic Church could establish pilgrimage sites for people to come to. And it again, you've probably heard me before in my lectures. As a Jew and as an academic, there's always been this like prejudice, like the Bible can't be true, the prophets weren't real. It was all written by later authors to justify later Jewish stuff and Jewish colonialism and Jewish life. And that has been disproven over and over again by archaeology. And I hate it when it crops up because it has to do with academic fashion. It'll go out of fashion for 10 years and it comes back into fashion. The reason I bring it up is because you're asking a question about where Jews and Palestinians or Arabs have traditionally lived. And you're asking for the real facts. I actually believe that there is actually no real reason, unless you have some historical reason, to change the name of a village. There's no reason to think Hebron isn't the same one that Abraham went to. I mean, like, why would, if anyone, I've been to Hebron many times. Why would it be? It's surrounded by desert. It has an oasis. It has caves. Families say, my family goes here from generations and generations beyond memory. Why would it be like in the middle of the night sometime Hebron got moved 100 miles? You know what I mean? Like, or why did it suddenly got renamed someday? Well, it used to be something else. Now it's that. Like, this is not that way. So I do think that the answer is that these areas of Ramallah, Bethlehem, Hebron, these have been Arab settlements, I think, back to biblical times. You know what I mean? I really do. And I know that in the Bible there's the story of the Jericho, and that's because remember that the Exodus comes around. They enter into Jordan, then they cross back into the Holy Land. And so Jericho becomes like one of the first places that it's a stronghold that they go up against. But so I think the answer just was that when the United Nations looked at it, they're like, look, Jerusalem already exists. It has an eastern part over that is basically part of the West Bank that has been Arab for at least since the Muslim conquest, okay? At least since Muhammad. And then you've got the Jewish part, which has been Jewish since at least before the Romans, right? And then the Jews like to settle on that side and up in the north where they've been forever, and Arabs have been over here. So it's a natural dividing line between between the two states. The issue of Gaza, and I'll turn it off right now, but you see where Gaza is. Originally, actually, Gaza was where the Philistines settled because it's right on the water. It's where my Philistine Vikings settled and conquered. But the real issue of Gaza is that no one wants it. If you've ever been to Gaza, it's got no natural resources. It's basically one large refugee camp. And one of the things that came out in the histories, I don't think it was in the documentary because I think it came out later, is that when Begin made peace with Anwar Sadat, he begged Egypt to take back Gaza because it was basically one big refugee camp with no natural resources. And that Sadat said absolutely not. So like the problem with Gaza is in a way no one wants it. There's a reason that Israel returned it to the Palestinians, and they pulled out settlements, which is it's not a great area. And so everyone's happy to say it's Palestinian because it's not worth anything. We know how that happens in America, right? With underprivileged communities. Yeah, they can have that area because it's no good and it's polluted and it's right next to the power plant. So anyway, so the issues of Gaza are separate, but I hope that answers your question. Yeah. By the way, XMR, you brought up a tricky issue and I don't want to offend you. So I want you to represent yourself and I will admire and support you. But you brought up briefly the issue of BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. So I want to give you a little bit of my take on it, but you're allowed to have your own. You're allowed to have your own take on everything in case you don't know. And once you become a Jew, you get tell off the rabbi. So, but one thing I want to say about BDS is this. BDS did not is a self-appointed leadership of the Palestine liberation cause. And it was started
Mhm.
by two brothers in Israel who I think one of them was at the University of Tel Aviv. They did not grow up, they were not West Bank. In other words, these are people who are representing their people, but we're not from their people. And it was very student, very ideological. And their idea
Mhm.
was basically to create, based on apartheid, based on the divestment movement around South Africa that worked, was to create a movement not in Israel and not really for a Palestinian state. It was to reach out, particularly in France and also in America, to foster anti-Semitism, to basically to basically use the Palestinian issue as a way of shaming Jews and fostering anti-Semitism, particularly on college campuses. The funny thing was, they thought they would be successful in France and Europe. It was really targeted in England as well, because France and England have really huge anti-Semitic histories and are very happy to have super smart people at snobby conferences at Oxford say awful
Mhm.
things about Israel and Jews. They actually ended up crazy successful in America. And they were, I think, very much surprised. And I remember that because I remember in 1994 walking through Berkeley's campus because I was so psyched to just visit Berkeley when I moved to the Bay Area in 93. And they were everywhere. All these demonstrations. And when I went up to the demonstrations, I found that the demonstrations were not students. They were students who had been hired to hand out pamphlets. When I said, "Well, I want to know more about the occupation of Palestine," they're like, "I have to tell you, you got to talk to that guy." So then I talked to that guy and I said, "These materials you're handing out, that's not factually accurate." And he started yelling. He was paid. He wasn't from Berkeley. So it's kind of like making it look like students are doing stuff, but it was really an outside organization coming in. And the pamphlets were full of really, really ugly propaganda that was historically untrue. I've had some pretty horrible experiences in my life. After 9/11, I approached the local, I was in charge of a 200 kid, a Jewish teen high school. And so I decided what we have to do after 9/11 is the first thing is I need to reach out to whatever Muslim school is around. So I found the Muslim parochial school in Palo Alto. And I asked to meet with them. And I said, let's do something together because we want to show you that we're not anti-Muslim and we need to make
Mhm.
sure Palo Alto knows this. And when I went into that meeting, it was not fruitful. They had a big display in their meeting area for the school, whatever it is, the lobby. And it was all about how the Jews were behind 9/11. This is Palo Alto. These are the kids
Mhm.
of engineers and professors. And I'm like, so the propaganda out there is really ugly and it's really anti Semitic. So my problem with BDS is that it was always intended as a movement to spread lies, to get people
Mhm.
worked up, and to really not do anything for Palestine, right? It doesn't help them. In fact, divesting doesn't help. Like they're against Jewish businesses that do work in the West Bank. All they do is mean that those people lose their jobs. When everyone stopped
Mhm.
buying soda streams to carbonate their water at Bed Bath and Beyond because they're made in the West Bank, all it did was put thousands of Palestinians out of work. Um,
Yeah, no. I'm not affiliated. And
oh
actually,
no, I
I
know you're
have
not.
a question about Juice for Choice. Have
Good.
you have you have
Good. But
you
let
heard
me
of
just
that?
finish one thought on that, and then we're
Okay,
going to get back to that. So,
okay.
so in a lot of ways, they've been really evil. That said, that may have been their origins, right? And it's really
Mhm.
ugly. But I mean, that was the early 90s, through the 90s, through 9/11, through 2000. We're in 2023. And I want to
Mhm.
acknowledge that the effect of that is that many well meaning Americans see BDS as a leadership voice. And so, even myself, I'm evolving as a progressive that I can't just cancel them. Does that make sense? So I just want to
Mhm.
say that I want us all to be aware of where they came from, but that doesn't mean we can cancel them because a lot of like they have become a real voice for the Palestinian cause. I think there's a lot of ugliness in their history. I think there's a lot of lies in their propaganda, but I think they have to be dealt with and I think they have to be included because I think what something Exiomara wrote in the chat area is something I agree with. Even though I've been, which is that the more you try to suppress voices, the more it's not leading to anything good. So I myself am in a difficult place, and my friends who are pro BDS, and they don't care what its origins were. They don't care what its mission was. They're trying to help Palestinians. They're trying to have a conversation. So I just want to say it's a really it's I just want to say that like we're all trying to juggle these issues. But I want to go to we thank you for speaking.
Oh, of course. I guess two things, just a primer. You should put a disclaimer as to how long those 3 videos are. They were like 8 hours back to back to back. I didn't even get a chance to watch the one on the Oz Accord or the movies. Those things just took up all my time. I think, and then the second thing is I don't think, I mean, the main thing I got out of the videos is it's way too complicated for one person to even try to comprehend all the intricacies of this whole situation, the whole conflict. That, you know, with that idea in mind, I mean, I look at these politicians in Israel right now, and I wonder, when they're looking at the Star of David, what are they thinking? Because first and foremost, Judaism and Jews in general, it's a witness religion, and you're a witness people. Torah was brought down on earth, and you're supposed to basically spread Torah to all the Gentiles. I don't think they're doing that over there. With the policies that are implemented, like you said, right now it is an apartheid state. So you have all these right-wing, ultra-Orthodox people, but it's kind of like, yeah, you're following the law, but read the prophets. What do they say? What was the downfall of every single king and eventually both kingdoms? What was the downfall? You're repeating it again. And it's kind of like, at the end of the day, I don't think any nation has Israel's interests at their, Israel's best interest at heart. It's going to have to be the people that are going to have to sit down. I think they have to reflect on Torah, and then they have to make the gesture. They have to step it up. That's just the way I see it.
First of all, I'm really glad you spoke. Thank you. I'm thank you, and I'll go back to Xamaria, but it's really ugly what's going on. And I just want to say that, I've said it before in the course that this 10 to 15%, it's really 15% of the country because they all have 14 kids. Because 3 of them know their parents are nuts and stop being it. And the other 10 believe it, and that's enough. It's not any form of Judaism that the prophets would support. It is racist. It is so narrow. You guys don't even know. I don't wish you to be in my shoes in terms of knowing how awful what they do is. Do you know that in the Talmud, one of its very famous lines is that one is not permitted to study Talmud all day and not hold a real job, because you will no longer have a proper view of what the tradition means. And yet that's exactly what the 15% of the population, they live off the tax dollars of the other 85%, so they can stay in yeshiva, which, like I said about it's the same thing in radical Islam. If you're going to sit all day at some indoctrination radical place, it's going to lead to terrible things in the society. So they're not even listening to the Talmud. They don't, and it's so painful. And I do see it a lot like Iran, which is remember, Iran's not even Arab. Iran was Persian. It was one of the top cultures in the world, going back thousands of years. Incredible civilization. And all the way up to when they started giving too much power to the small percentage of the population that was fundamentalist Islam. And look what has happened to that country. Just giving that small percentage of even today, most Iranians are modern. They would be happy to have alliances with the United States. They love America. And it's what's happened. And then Israel's just copied them. Give a little power to that small, and just make sure they support the politicians in power. It's awful on so many Torah levels that you're pointing out, and like I said at the beginning, honestly, I think what it comes down to is the Torah is true, which is that if you act outside of Torah, then the land will spit you out. And I see the Jews who really did have, I mean, if I'm being frank, and I'll cut this off the recording, I believe the Jews had the moral high ground here. I believe they could have coexisted with the Palestinians. I think we were attacked in war after war after war, that Arab governments that supported the Nazis and allied with them and then wanted to exterminate us after they lost. I think Jews had the high ground, and we don't anymore. You know, we had every right to live there morally. And now I'm like, what's next? I mean, I just don't know what's next for an awful national. I mean, it's this awful, weird, fundamentalist nationalism, you know, like that's dehumanizing other people. So I don't know where it's going to go, but I really appreciate you calling it out. Eximara.
So, I mean, fundamentalism of any stripe, I mean, Christian evangelicals, you know, they want to make this country, you know, whatever, their heaven. Florida is going to be their heaven, you know, no gay people, no this, no teaching anybody history. I mean, fundamentalism, the only thing is that they had, you know, we could fall into that trap kind of easily. Fortunately, well, anyways,
No, you're right.
the problem with fundamentalism, right, is that it spawns other fundamentalisms, right, in reaction to it. So Tiana's point about the history is really interesting to me as a teacher who teaches history, 1619 being one example, that what presses on people's attention today, you know, really takes up much more space than the history. And so that is just a way of explaining. When I use BDS and its suppression, whatever, I just use that as an expression of a representation of how current events, you know, make other things disappear. And when you think of apartheid in South Africa, and BDS, as I said, I'm not affiliated. I don't really know much about the organization, but boycotts have been at the forefront of civil disobedience, right? Nonviolent civil disobedience. Divestment has been at the forefront of nonviolent disobedience. So harnessing that has been incredibly effective, right? Because it's perceived to having brought South Africa's apartheid to an end. I'm not really sure that's exactly how it happened, but so I was trying to show how people who are not anti-Semitic, right, would buy into the movement.
Right.
And as you say, not aware of the history. And so it's important for that history. I mean, it's not coincidental that, right, all the Holocaust museums are about remembering history, right? So it's just more, it's even more important for people to be aware of this history. The problem, it's so complicated that any one person could reduce it and simplify it, you know, and make it an us versus them. And, you know, and people always want the underdog, you know, to win, right? So if you have, so there's these tendencies, these human tendencies to kind of boil things down reductively that lead to, you know, so much bad faith, right? And then I did want to ask you, because I know some friends in the academy who are part of this organization called Jews for Choice. Does that make about?
I'm not sure. No? We'll wrap up in a second, guys. But
yeah.
No, but like, tell me. I know some of them, Jewish Voices for Peace, things like that. But what?
That might be it. That might be it. And what I've heard this one person say was their critique of Zionists are Israel right or wrong, right? That's the way they frame pro-Israel people, which of course is reductive, right? I mean, this idea that if it's wrong, then you must you must think they're right, versus if something's wrong, we need to come up with a different solution, you know? So I'm just interested in the way that the US and American Jewry factors into the political situation in Israel, because my understanding is that people, you know, there is this really strong connection, and people in Israel don't necessarily like the influence of American Jewry in Israel. Is that true?
Yeah, no, it's true. I get told to shut up
Okay.
because like my right-wing Jews in the synagogue are like, if I say something they like, then they're all happy. If I say something they don't like, they say, you're a diaspora Jew. You have to live in Israel and serve in the army. I say, well, you didn't live in Israel and serve in the army. And they're like, yeah, that's because I love Israel. But you don't love Israel because you have a different position. That's the Jewish community thing. People on the right say they're Israel lovers and you don't love it. And so yeah, no, I get that all the time. I wish we had more time, but and I'd love to talk about these issues, but you know, I won't today. One thing I will leave as an open question, because you know it's an open question already, or you all have had your heads in the stand, is if you're for those who criticize Israel, is there an element of anti-Semitism in it? And that's just an open philosophical question. And it's probably a little bit like, I think it was we saying that we can't keep all of this in our head at the same time, because I mean, you have to admit, I was just talking to a U of M student, and about the fact that all of his friends are like, if you're not anti-Israel, you can't be our friend anymore. And I said, well, have you ever asked them, like, well, you know, you guys don't seem to be talking about China and a million Uyghurs, I'm pronouncing it wrong, but I mean, have you read about that? I mean, forcible sterilization, rape, separating families, straight up murder, right? So like, are you supposed to be against that? So he's like, so he brought it up and he came back to me. I said, how'd it go? He's like, oh yeah, we're against that too. It just doesn't come up much. You know, so like there is a question about, well, Palestinians, by the way, it's not a genocide. Let's be honest. I mean, as I said in a sermon several years ago, um, they say, you know, Palestinian children are killed every day, and you know, the BDS says things like this. And I said, by their own reports, not BDS's, but by own human rights organizations like Amnesty and others who are pretty anti-Israel, their own reports report often, you know, year to year, about 120 Palestinians died, many from fire from other Palestinians because they're killed by Gazans firing things that don't know how to fire things. And then others killed in Israeli prisons, which is ugly and disgusting. But I mean, you're talking about like 100 people a year. That's not the biggest genocide. So there is an element of anti-Semitism, which is all we want to talk about is Israel, even though I'm a European or I'm an American and I'm privileged.
I see.
I mean,
Yeah.
on the other hand, sometimes it's not. Because like, does that mean we shouldn't be talking about, does that mean that does that mean any of you couldn't decide, you know, I've just had it with Jewish nationalism, with this awful governments and the Orthodox taking over. And I just think maybe it would be better if it was turned back over to, not back over, they never had in the first place, but turned over to, I don't know, just make it a democracy. And then the Jews will be a minority and, you know, they'll learn what it's like to be a minority. Anyway, these are hard philosophical questions, and I just want to say you all seem very well positioned to enter the unenviable position of being a Jew in the world where people will bring up very anti-Israel or very imperialist right-wing Israel things, and you're left to figure out how you handle those social interactions. But as far as I'm concerned, you're all good. So I welcome you to the fold. Thanks for coming today. I know we meet in 2 weeks. I really enjoyed our conversation. I really admire the thinking that you've obviously done and the commitment you showed. And I will put a disclaimer. I have to figure out a way to shorten it for me now, because I know I didn't mean, that's a bit oppressive. So thanks for the tip. Everyone have a great week and enjoy the beautiful weather. Take care.